Good evening and welcome to this King's Talk on the NHS. My name is Greg Hunter and I am the Deputy Head Co-Curricular here at King's. Tonight, we are delighted to welcome back to King's virtually former Marlow boy, Dr. Andy Stein, as he presents the history, organisation and commissioning of the NHS. Andy left King's in 1979 and is a consultant renal and general physician at the University Hospitals Coventry and Warwickshire NHS Trust. He has written 5 books as an undergraduate lecturer and is an authority on the history and structure, finance and organisation in NHS. We are absolutely privileged to have Andy with us. At any time, please, during this presentation and question and answer, please type your question into the Q&A function as part of Zoom. Or alternatively, if you put your virtual hand up, and please do that because it really is exciting when you do, we can put you live on the air to ask your question yourself. And now it is with great pleasure that I welcome Andy. Welcome, Andy.
Good evening, and thank you, Greg, and thank you, everybody, for giving up your evenings or part of your evenings to hear me talk a bit about what it's like to be a doctor and how to train as a doctor in today's NHS. Before I start, you'll realise that the title of the talk, which I gave you, is actually different from what I am going to talk about, which is history, organisation and commissioning. And that's because Greg would only give me 5 minutes and 5 slides for my talk, and I didn't think I could do problems and solutions. Maybe we can do that another time. If you're really interested in problems and solutions, on my website that I'll talk about later, there's an article entitled Jammed Hospitals, and that explains it all. Anyway, on with the show. So I'm going to mainly focus on this in this session about becoming a doctor and training as a doctor in my career, but I am going to start off with a short talk on the subject I described. But before I do that, I thought I'd just tell you a little bit about one of my normal days. And this was a day that I had at work yesterday. So I was doing a kidney clinic. Kidneys, as you've learned, are my thing. And I saw for the second time a 53-year-old man. And this guy was a bodybuilder and a bouncer. And he is what my mother would call a rough diamond, dear. And he's from a not particularly nice bit of Coventry. He presented, that's a fancy doctor's word for saying he went to hospital in January. And he went to another local small hospital with shortness of breath, and he thought he was going to die. And he would have died, but they did a really good job on him. They found he was in heart failure, didn't know why. He was in kidney failure with 30% kidney function, getting worse, heading for dialysis, and he had a big hernia in the middle of his tummy. So they did a really good job and took advice from us. We're the big teaching hospital nearby, both the heart doctors and us, the kidney doctors. And by the time he left, his kidneys were much better, 50% function stable, but the cause of his heart failure was not discovered. Anyway, I saw him in clinic, and it was a real job to get him to clinic because he had DNA'd appointment. That means he did not come to an appointment. And he's a guy that you would not fancy sitting next to on the bus. But I tried very hard to chase him and rang him a couple of times. And when I eventually got through to him, I persuaded him to come and see me. And he's seen me twice now. First appointment, I was quite gentle with him and just got to know him. Second appointment, I examined him, and I think I've cracked what's wrong with him. I think perhaps the heart failure is due to a leaky valve that led to the kidney failure, and the hernia has nothing to do with it. So he's now in a process whereby I'll try to fix or at least stabilize his kidneys. I'll get him seen by a heart specialist, and he may need a heart operation. But if he does what I tell him, he could be alive in 15 years' time. And if he doesn't do what I tell him, he'll be dead in the next 3 to 6 months. So the situation is quite serious. But I feel I have his confidence now. I'm quite good with the rough, tough types. I learned that through rugby at King's. and I'm sure that he will do well. And anyway, so he is an absolutely typical patient that I deal with. And he's a challenge because he's a challenging guy, he's rough and tough, and he's got 2 major body system failures. Anyway, that's what I do, that's my day job. So on with the show, and can I have the first slide, please?
Of course, Andy, and that was quite an inspirational start. Okay, here we go.
So this is me, and as you can see, I've got a few degrees. I wouldn't be over impressed by them. Most senior doctors at my stage will have a load of degrees like that. Doesn't mean very much, other than the work continues after O levels, I'm afraid, boys and girls, and goes on till you're at least 30, and then you can stop doing exams. But then the work really starts after that. Anyway, more of that later. As you can see, I'm a kidney doctor. Nephrologist means I'm a kidney doctor, and I'm a physician. That means I'm a thinker, not a doer. I don't do operations. I do dialysis, organized dialysis, kidney transplants, kidney pancreas transplants. I send them to Oxford. Kidney liver transplant, I send them to Birmingham. And that's what I do. I'm also chairman of the Arts Committee, and we've got a newish hospital which was built in 2006, and we've covered it with over 500 pieces of art, and I'm quite proud of that. I lecture at the medical school. I have medical students with me all the time. I have 2 students who change every 10 weeks. I also have 2 management roles. I work for the sub-regional level of NHS administration, which is now called an ICS, and I work as a troubleshooter for NHS England. I work in underperforming hospitals. So, but my connection with King's is I was at King's for 5 years long ago. Next slide, please. So this is me, this is my life and career. I'm quite old, as you can see, fairly conventional, married, 2 kids of Leamington Spa, and water polo is my big hobby. I was at Junior King's School, then senior, and I was a day boy and commuted from Ashford, which was a bit of a pain, but anyway, it had to be done. And my great inspiration at the school was the biology teacher called Mr. Wilkinson, and he was the one who really directed me and encouraged me to apply for Nottingham University when I decided to be a doctor. I come from a very medical family. In fact, I'm the 7th Dr. Stein. Both my parents were GPs, and I'm very fond of GPs. I think they're the most important bit of the NHS, and they are wrongly criticised in the media, in my opinion. I eventually, after many years training, became a consultant. That means I'm a boss. I work in a department of 15 consultants in Coventry, which is a major teaching hospital in the north. I know that you're all down in Kent, and some of you may not know what or where Coventry is, but I'll give you a bit of a geography lesson now. It's the 9th biggest conurbation in the country. So how about that? These are a few of the places I've worked in. And I totted this up for this talk. In fact, I've worked in 50 different hospitals in 7 countries on 4 continents, including, which I guess Greg's own country, Australia, which I really liked. I also have quite a few hobbies. By the way, the picture on the left is Coventry Cathedral, which is about the only nice thing in central Coventry, and is worth coming to see for an hour and then immediately leaving. So my side hustles, well, I like writing books, and that started in 1997 with my first book called Kidney Failure Explained. And I specialize in patient books, and my latest one, Understanding the NHS, I'll talk a bit about later. I run 3 websites, one which is called MyHSN. I wrote that for A-level students and people in the early years at university who think they want to work in the NHS. So there's a particular section there, which is a special view called NHS Systems. Right, next slide, please. So describing the history of the NHS is almost impossible on one slide, but I've had a go. It's like being asked to describe the history of football or art. People pontificate about it. over many, many years and decades and never get it right, and it's changing all the time. So how did it all start? Well, people think the NHS started in 1914. It didn't really. It really goes back to the late 19th century and the good old Victorians. And in fact, the original stimulus for the NHS was actually the Crimean War. And here we are again at war in Crimea. And at that war, where we didn't do very well, I think we lost on away goals, it was discovered that many of the men chosen to fight in the British Army were not fit to fight. In fact, only about a third of those recruited were fit enough to fight. So the Victorians felt something had to be done. And Lloyd George, who was later the Prime Minister, initially the Minister of Health, though it wasn't called the Minister of Health, in fact, the Minister of Health hadn't started at that point, came up with the National Insurance Act. And this was a very sexist and misogynist act whereby working men were given, inverted commas, free medical care by the state, but their employer had to contribute as well. And their families, their wives and their children got no health care. And they were given the choice of a panelized group of doctors. And in fact, my father, who was a GP pre Second World War, was such a panel doctor. And the way the finance of doctors now exists in the NHS actually is the same as in 1911. And I can talk about that for hours at another time. So Bevan was the Minister of Health that is given the reward as the man who started the NHS. Famously, he was a Welsh ex-miner. Of course, it wasn't him. It was Beveridge, it was Attlee, it was Churchill, it was everybody. It wasn't any one person. So it didn't go very well at the start. The BMA, our great union, of which I'm not a member, opposed it. And I'm ashamed of my own profession for opposing the birth of the NHS. Certainly my mother and father were very keen on the NHS. Couldn't understand why doctors didn't want it. But eventually it got going. It had problems from the start. It was found to be 3 times the price that was predicted, and fairly rapidly in 1952, free prescriptions, glasses, dentists was all dropped. In fact, Bevan resigned on that issue. So we move on to the 60s. Important things happened. It was a time of peace and love, and there were important abortion bills and family planning bills, but there was also a big plan for building new hospitals. And this was led by Enoch Power, a Conservative, and many of the hospitals we have today are based on those plans. It in the 70s was reorganized under Labour. I'm deliberately putting the political parties in at the time to make you realize that no one party has really developed the NHS. Both parties have. It was reorganized. My mother, who's 94 and still alive, was in fact involved in that reorganization. She was very senior in the NHS at the time, in fact, advised the minister. I remember when I was going to school, at medical school, I'd ask mum where she was. She said, "Oh, I'm just chatting to somebody." And then the somebody was Virginia Bottomley, who was whoever was the Minister of Health at the time. So I realized my mum was playing at a very high level. It was reorganized into a 3-tier structure, which I'll talk about another time. By the 1980s, both parties, particularly Conservatives, realised that the NHS had major problems. There was a big thing called the Black Report that showed that poor people don't live very long, and rich people do live a long time. And this inequality of healthcare is actually now getting wider, not smaller, unfortunately. But this led to a lot of changes, and Mrs. Thatcher and the cabinet at the time realised something had to be done, and they decided that the market, bringing a business model of the internal market to the NHS, was the solution. This was kicked off by a famous report called the Griffith Report, and this led to the plethora of what we would now call managers that work in the NHS. My mum always reminds me, in a large London teaching hospital post-war, there was one manager who was called the hospital secretary, usually a retired brigadier. Now we've got 500-600 such people, and I think we probably need them because hospitals are very complicated. So they brought the market, they brought the concept of a purchaser, somebody with money buying healthcare from a provider like a hospital or a GP, and they tried to introduce the politics of the market and hoped for a trickle-down effect where the better hospitals came up with more investment and their money trickled down. But I think many of us now don't believe in this trickle-down effect. Labour, surprisingly, under Blair and Brown, approved of the internal market, in fact, developed it. They developed targets, which you hear about on the radio, 4-hour target, 18-week target. There were also a lot of scandals in the 2000s, particularly famous ones were Alder Hey, Bristol, Shipman. These were the big three that got to the public attention. By the early 2010s, the now Tories were back in. They decided to turn up the vaults, introduce more market forces and introduce more competition with financial punishments and legal punishments if you were not shown to compete with a provider in Belgium, for example. Many of us at the time thought this was nuts and is not what the public wanted, because it also put hospitals at each other's throats, whereby we were in financial competition with our local hospitals. So in Kent, the hospital in Canterbury would have been in financial competition with Ashford, for example, which is crazy. Fortunately, the government of the day now have realised some sense and now reversing these changes in the quietest revolution in political history, which is why it's not hitting the papers and why I'm telling you about it. Anyway, that's what's happening now. And of course, we've had a bit of a pandemic, as we all know. Next slide, please. So how is it organised? Well, it's big, it's complicated. It employs 1.5 million people, which is the biggest employer in the UK and Europe. It's the 5th biggest employer in the world, behind the Chinese army and McDonald's and a few other people. The line of management is from the top, from the Prime Minister through the Secretary of State. I think we've had 3 Secretaries of State in about 3 months. So the politicians are doing a good job of confusing us at the moment, and the new one, like the previous one, hasn't got a hope in hell of sorting it out, but they'll have a go. I worked at a national level for some years trying to introduce a 7-day NHS, and I'm said to be an expert on the effects of the weekend, and the Wikipedia page on the weekend I largely wrote on behalf of NHS England, and basically shows an 11% increase in mortality if you're admitted to hospital at the weekend. And if you add all of that up, it makes COVID looks like a walk in the park. Millions of people have died of a nasty case of the weekend and still are. So that's my little hobby horse, and the weekend has still not been fixed. But that, I think, is for your generation out there, not me. The NHS England has 7 regions. Interestingly, healthcare has devolved, so the other 3 nations have their own health services, but in our NHS in England there are 7 regions, and we've changed the local level administration recently from over 200 things called CCGs to 42 sub-regional things, about the size of a county, 1 million people, called ICSs, and I work for the Coventry and Warwickshire ICS. Confusingly, there are many other organisations that are half linked to the NHS, but are deliberately, partly for democratic reasons, not directly part of the NHS. And that's because I just pull out UKHSA, which is the UK's new public health organisation. The old Public Health England was axed by the government because of perceived poor performance during COVID. And in fact, you know, there was no plan for COVID, as we all know, and there could have been. But it's important these organisations are only loosely linked to the NHS because they may have to sanction the NHS in some way. Social care is one of the biggest problems in healthcare. Every hospital in the land, about a quarter to a third of the patients are fit for discharge, we call them medically fit for discharge, but they've got nowhere to go. The families don't want them. There are no spaces in nursing homes. The council won't pay, and they're doomed, and they live in hospital for months on end, and many will die there. And that is one of the tragedies of our society. And everybody on this call is partly to blame for this. We have the choice as people in our society to look after our elderly, and let's be frank, we don't. So don't start me on social care, or I'll never stop. Next slide. So finally, commissioning the money. This is really, really complicated, and it keeps changing, and it's just beyond this talk, I'm afraid. Just know that the NHS is extremely expensive. 150 billion a year, went up to about 190 during COVID. It's about 10% of your hard-earned taxes, and I think we should, to be frank, stop pumping money into the NHS. It's like trying to fix a broken radio by buying another broken radio. It needs a complete rethink, and that's where your generation is coming in, because you're going to fix it, because unfortunately we failed. It's quite good value, about 2,500 per person per year, compared to a minimum of say 4,000 for private insurance in the States, for example. Is it any good? Well, when I qualified in 1984, I must admit, I thought it was appalling, and I couldn't believe the state of our NHS. So I gave it a solid D. Slowly over the years, through massive investment and massive reorganization, it started to work, and there was a golden period in the Brown Blair years, but this was really based not just on what the Labour Party did, but what the Conservative Party did before that. And I think the internal market was helping in some ways, even though crazy in other ways. Now it's back to nearly where we started, with over as we know, 6 million people waiting for operations. Some patients, if I refer for a hip replacement, will wait 2 years. And if you're aged 82, that's can be 90% of the rest of your life. So it really is not serving the public very well. I think the public are very fed up with not being able to get through to a GP, not being able to have a face-to-face appointment. It's just not good. Anyway, I'd be interested in what you think. And perhaps you could email me with your thoughts. I'd just like to briefly mention a website called MyHSN, which is something which, as I spoke about earlier, I've written partly for you and other A-level students, and there's a book linked to it, which I'm sorry is not free, but it's quite cheap if you're interested in buying a book. Okay, so that's the end of my talk, and now over to Greg for some questions.
Wow, Andy, thank you so much for that introduction and that talk. I mean, I've got to try and stop myself here, because some of the stuff to do with the NHS is a bit of a hobby horse of mine too. So
really? Okay.
Oh yes. So I suspect, just in terms of viewpoints, and I will get to them at some stage, and I do want to open up the talk, the questions to the floor first, and let's just sort of go from there. Just sort of a few simple questions. Sort of, why did you go into medicine in the first place? Are you from a family of doctors?
Yeah. So I'm from a very medical family, but both my parents were GPs, and my mother was later on a very senior NHS administrator who worked at government level. So my mother's quite famous, so it's always a problem having a famous mother. Fortunately, she used her maiden name. And I went into it, and it sounds a bit bizarre, just because I was interested in science, particularly biology, particularly human biology. I've always been fascinated. And I remember at school when we dissected frogs and things like that, I don't know if that's still done, and rats. I was always fascinated with what was inside a rat or a frog. And I can remember also wanting to cut a human arm open and see what was underneath. But so my interests were really more pure science rather than caring. The whole caring thing came a lot later.
Yeah, thank you. And why sort of why did you choose Nottingham in the first place, and how long's the training?
Well, the standard training in the UK is 5 years, and Nottingham's 5 years, 6 years at Oxbridge, 4 years for postgraduate courses, which we have in Warwick, where I teach now. I basically chose there because Mr. Wilkinson recommended it, and he said it's your type of place, Andy. And I think he thought I was a bit of a rebel, and I ought to sort of not go to Oxbridge. I don't think I was clever enough to apply for Oxbridge. He also knew that I wanted to really get out there into the workforce quickly. And Oxbridge was 7 years because you had to do an extra Oxbridge year. And also he knew that Nottingham, Leicester and Southampton were all new university medical schools. They were all about 5 years old, and he thought that I'd like to go to somewhere new. So I went up there on his recommendation. I just liked it and applied, and fortunately I got the grade, so I got in.
Fantastic. I mean, it's interesting. In my, you mentioned Australia before to me. I've got some relatives who've become doctors and surgeons, etc. And in Australia, they've gone from it being an undergraduate degree to postgraduate. So yes, there's a 6-year undergraduate degree, but about 20 years ago, it all of a sudden turned. Yeah. You had to do a sciencey type degree first, and then it was postgraduate.
Well, the UK is changing to that sort of model in some medical schools, and Warwick was one of the pioneers. And that's one of the reasons I wanted to go to Coventry, because I was around at the birth of the medical school. And we started off only taking science graduates, then realized they were a bit boring. So we went for social sciences, were more interesting. Then we went for the humanities, and now we go for anybody with half a brain who's determined. And in fact, one of my recent students had no degree. He had a music qualification, and he found it really tough because there is a lot of basic science, but it's amazing. Most of the students just teach themselves medicine from YouTube now. They kind of don't need us anymore. And I think that's how he survived. And in fact, he used to write songs to remind the other students what the cranial nerves did. And he put them on YouTube. And so I think anybody can be a doctor. You just need, reasonable brain and to be really determined.
It's I'll ask one more question. This is one of my own questions of a different kind, and then we'll go to the questions from the floor. I don't know if you read, one of my favorite books I've read in the last few years is by the medic turned comedian Adam Kay, This Is Going to Hurt. I don't know if you've read the book, but basically he was a doctor, and he, because of the conditions, he was obviously he was a comedian as well. Because of the conditions, he left, and he's written a fantastic book which highlights the working conditions of junior doctors and those that have just come out of training, medicine training, as just appalling. Do you have a take on that?
I do. You're probably not going to like what I'm about to say. I mean, I actively didn't read the book, and I don't read books like that because for me it's a busman's holiday. But also, I don't like whingers, and I felt that he and many junior doctors now moan too much. My mother post-war got no time off at all. And you had a day off with the consultant's permission for your own wedding, or perhaps the death of a first-degree relatives. When I was a junior doctor, I worked every third night, every third weekend. And when I say work night, you work all day, all night, and all the next day. Now, clearly that's crazy, and we made terrible decisions, and it's unsafe for the patients. But, they work 48-hour weeks now. What about people in corner shops? And I bet you most teachers work more than 48 hours. And so I don't have a lot of time for them. And I'm known for my lack of sympathy when they want to leave the ward at 1 minute to 5 with a patient who's about to die, which is sometimes what they do. But somebody has got to be the future. I'm kind of in the pre-retirement zone. I'm not retiring for a few years, but we need young people like on this call to get into medicine, and we need them to roll their sleeves up and sort out the mess. So sorry if that's not your view, and it's I'm sure it's a humorous book, and we could all tell hilarious stories.
Look, please don't get me wrong. It's a refreshing viewpoint you're bringing. I have no specific view on it at all. It was just it's just a take. It's one person's opinion, and it's really good to get it balanced with actually a different reality opinion as well from yourself.
The reason they're so grumpy is money. Let's be frank. they build up such huge debts at university, particularly if they've done 2 degrees, can't pay it off for a very long time. Their starting salary is about 27,000, but they all want to live in flats in trendy bits of London, and it just doesn't equate. And then they start moaning, and it's money is the big thing for them. Also, even though they do work a 48-hour week, about half of their weekends are affected by on-call. And they don't like that because their friends are off and, you know, going to trendy bars in London, etc. So, but, you know, that's the nature of the job. And if you don't like it, you know, don't apply to medical school and then moan that you've got to work at the weekend. Yeah,
and I think that's an absolute fair point. Let's go to some of the questions from that have come in from those watching. Andrew says, fascinating talk. Thank you for speaking to us. Are there too many NHS managers, and should they be as localised as they are?
No, actually, I'm full of controversial views, as you've learned. I actually don't think we don't have enough of them. We certainly don't have enough IT people. You know, our IT department's tiny. You know, it's about 20 staff. We've got, you know, 500-600 managers. And most there are big industries near me like JLR and other big car firms, and they put about 10% of their budget into IT, and the NHS puts a tiny percentage into IT. And so I'd have lots and lots of IT people, and the managers, I think we don't pay them enough. You know, I think you know, if you many of them will be on 30, 40, 50,000. But if you want to get good people, you may have to, you know, pay 150 and give them a BMW. And I would say we probably need a few more, particularly IT, and I'd massively increase their pay to get better quality people. And if I don't know if anybody's interested in being a hospital manager, there's an article on my website about it. It's quite a good career. And if you get up to executive level, it's a really interesting life. And I think not enough people really think about becoming a hospital manager.
Yeah. Next question is, do you think the emergence of video consultations and telephone consultations since the pandemic have helped solve problems, or are they creating new problems?
Very good question. I think both. I think a lot of the public, particularly the elderly, really dislike video and telephone appointments. They like to see doctors face to face and touch them and be examined. And I've seen so many mistakes. I've seen people die or be maimed or go blind because of COVID. And I think our response to COVID, now it's always easy in retrospect, was an overreaction. And, you know, it was a disease with a 1% mortality that wasn't that infectious. And it almost led to the collapse of Western civilization. So we have to be more robust and be able to ride the storm, but not in an Australia-like way where you just shut up shop and close your country off for, you know, 2 or 3 years. I think if we had another pandemic, you know, we should probably adopt the Swedish approach if it is not that infectious and not that dangerous, and just ride the storm. But going back to the question, for follow-up appointments for hospital doctors, it's ideal. Because if you know your patient, you know what's wrong with them, you've examined them, you've got a treatment plan, a telephone appointment is absolutely ideal because it saves them a journey to the hospital, a fight in the car park. The car park's really expensive, a fight to get home, and all for a, you know, 10-minute meeting with a junior doctor who doesn't make a decision and says, I'll see you in 6 months. So in the new world, they're seeing the consultants much more, the bosses, because we're the only ones, if you like, trained to do virtual appointments. So I think there are pros and cons to it, but generally pros, but we've got to do something about general practice, and particularly the elderly, because they, you know, elderly people like cash, they don't like cards, and they like touching doctors, and they don't like talking to them on the phone or a video.
Yeah, no, I understand that. Margot asks, You mentioned in some aspects how the NHS has failed. Where do you think they have succeeded, perhaps compared to their international counterparts with state-funded healthcare like France?
That's a fantastic question, Margot. As you can tell, I've got very high standards, and it would take a lot to give me the NHS an A, because for an A is excellent, and you've got to achieve that 7 days a week, every year, every decade, for me to give you an A. So when I give, the NHS its current C-, it's because it's a C- in my opinion. Now the public may feel it's better than that. I think it has succeeded in some ways. I think general practice has been a success, and in that everybody in the UK does have a GP. The method of payment of GPs is incredibly simple. That really helps, cuts out a load of admin. They are paid for patients registered, not crucially like France, for episodes of care. In France and other countries, people get paid extra for doing things like more appointments, more scans, etc., etc. So they're halfway to the States, where people are massively over investigated and over treated because everybody benefits financially. General practice is struggling now just under sheer weight of work. Hospitals, I think we've done okay. There were really big problems when I went into nephrology, kidney medicine. There was a famous article written by a German kidney doctor in a European journal called NDT, and it started with an equation. It said kidney failure plus dialysis in UK equals death. And that was the title of the paper, and we were all horrified, and we thought, that's the Germans just getting at us again. But they were right, absolutely right. And we had very poor dialysis and transplant facilities for the UK when I went into it in the late 80s. But that's all been solved. So I think the other thing that is now working well is what we call networks. So we've largely, over the years, just ignored the government and whatever plans they've got. And obviously, most of us fought against this internal market thing, which we thought was nuts. And we decided that the public wanted us to cooperate with GPs and small hospitals with big hospitals, and, Kent hospitals with London hospitals, and us with Birmingham. And so we largely kind of ignored what we were told to do. And I think because of that, we developed, so for example, stroke would be a good example. So if you have a stroke in Romney Marsh, for example, you may not be taken to one hospital, but I'm not sure where your stroke centre is. It'll be Canterbury or Ashford, but they will take you to the regional centre for stroke. And that doesn't happen in many countries. You don't get that cooperation between hospitals. So I think we've done well, and clearly, I think we've also done well in the links with the drug industry. I think having companies like GSK in the UK has been very helpful, and we work well with the drug industry to develop drugs quickly, cooperate on trials. Brexit is going to be a problem, but that's being sorted. There's an organisation called MRHA that finds out whether drugs are safe, and they're now working well with the drug industry. So I think we'll get past Brexit on that one. And I think the vaccination programme was an example of where the drug industry and the government worked, very well together. And I think, the government played a blinder on that one.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. It would be wonderful to put somebody there if they would like to ask their question themselves of Andy. Please put your virtual hand up if you'd like to do that. Someone asks here, an anonymous person, what is the solution to the ongoing bed crisis in the NHS?
Oh, this is a big talk. It's nearly impossible to sort quickly. It will take decades. I'll give you three of the biggest problems. Probably the biggest problem is something my mother tried to sort out in the late 70s. which is the fact that we mix elective, that means planned care, like operations, like a hip replacement, and emergency care, like a frail old lady with dementia who's a bit more confused than normal because she's got a urinary tract infection. So that's the type of patient I look after. And so the surgeons hate it because we put these patients, they call them old grannies, of ours, nothing to do with them, in their beds, and then they have to cancel operations. And when the NHS was set up, none of this really mattered because there weren't that many operations that were possible, and also ITU didn't exist, and somebody with dementia, we just let them die. So we now are in a world which is much more complicated, but we need to split all of our hospitals in half. So that's the first thing. And have massive surgical treatment centres all over the country, and the government is starting to do them to their credit.
Specialised surgical treatments, or just
you're both. They need to do boring, routine stuff like hip replacements, cataracts, and also the high risk operations probably have to be done at a place like mine because you have the cavalry there, like ICU and us lot, to do dialysis. But 95% of operations should not be done in a hospital like mine, in my opinion. So that's probably the biggest problem.
I was just going to ask, so would you then have your hospital there in Coventry you could have that as a kidney specialist hospital, and all the people with major kidney problems go to?
No, you divide it up in terms of medicine and surgery. So kidney operations could go in the surgical half of the hospital, and kidney dialysis in my half. But the corridor between the two should be not quite wide enough to take a trolley. So we can't put medical patients in surgical beds. It's a disaster. So second problem is 7-day working, because the public now come into hospital at roughly the same rate at weekends. They never used to. And most teams don't work at weekends. My team does. We do ward rounds 7 days a week, but most teams don't. So most teams don't discharge any patients. So by Monday, the hospital's full up, and we've got patients in cupboards, patients in the car park. We've got patients 2 in a bed. I'm exaggerating, but we've got patients everywhere. So the weekend is a full-scale disaster. And the worst time to be admitted to hospital is the Easter weekend, because you've got 4 days where nothing happens. You get a big spike in mortality then, and you come into total chaos on Tuesday. Problem number 3, and it's difficult to choose my number 3, but I'd probably say IT. Our computers are an absolute disaster. There's no national computer system. There could be. Some regional ones are starting, and some bits of the country have them. These are largely American systems, one called Epic. We're getting one called Cerner. And we need all of those in, and we need them to link up in a national EPR, electronic patient record, and all of that needs to be linked to the app. And I think the app could be a part of the solution to the NHS. But again, it's the watchers of this video that are going to have to sort out these big three problems. And if you do all of that, and I haven't even mentioned social care, which is kind of another big problem. I just talked about the medical problems, but just briefly on social care. Social care is even more of a terrible state than the NHS, and I think social care and the health service should come together. We have a Department of Health and Social Care, but we don't really run social care. It's largely another ministry. It's a ministry, we call it the Ministry of Levelling Up and Gynecology. We don't even know the name of the ministry above the council. But we need to take it out of that ministry, or we go into that ministry. And social care is funded by the state, and our taxes should go up significantly, in my view.
Okay.
5%, no messing with 0.5% or 1%, just bang everything up.
So all our taxes at all the levels should just go up by 5%.
Yeah, absolutely.
Just to cover the shortfall in social care and
well, the public can't have it both ways. You can't not look after your granny in your house which most of the public won't do, and then expect the state to pay for it all.
Yeah.
You can't have your cake and eat it, but that's what the public expect and want. But that's why I'm not Prime Minister, because I wouldn't get elected on a 5% rise in taxes.
No, you'd be supporting in other ways, absolutely. Let's change tack slightly, because we will get back into the nitty-gritty there. Andrew asked, would you prepare to share the proudest moment of your career?
Oh, wow. Well, I've got a research proud moment. I did research for 5 years, and I presented my research to the American Society of Nephrology in the States, in Baltimore. And so it's the highest level of research meeting for a kidney doctor. And I got one of the long talks, which is a kind of privilege. There are short talks and posters. And so there was a room of 500-600 of the top kidney doctors in the world, and all the Americans are in the front row. And at the end, I was absolutely terrified at the start of the talk, but I gave my talk, and then at the end, a couple of the great and the good, very famous kidney doctors nodded, and that was it. The nod from these two famous kidney doctors, that meant the last 5 years of your life has been worth it. Or if they hadn't nodded, that would have been the last 5 years of my life was a complete waste of time. So that was one. The other was a young man. I have to be careful about telling this story because I normally cry. So when I was I was a senior registrar at King's in London, and I had a consultant above me who, shall we say, wasn't often there, as it used to be the case. And I had a young man. He was a baker, from tall, fat, lovely guy from Crystal Palace, an extremely rare kidney disease. And I'd never seen it before, but it fitted the textbooks. And I was 95% certain that's what it was. And it's always a Friday, he came on a Friday, and I couldn't persuade the boss to see him. And then the next day, I couldn't persuade the boss to see him. And he needed a very special treatment, which we were able to do at King's for this extremely rare disease, but he wouldn't let me do it. And I kept ringing him and saying, please let me do this special treatment on him. And he wouldn't let me do it. He said, I'll see him tomorrow. Anyway, he died of a stroke the following Tuesday. And that was my fault. I should have stood up to the boss. And anyway, a few years later, when I was a consultant in Coventry, I had a very similar patient. Friday, it's always Friday. And I felt he had this extremely rare disease. It's the kind of thing you only see once every 5 years, even as a kidney specialist. Anyway, I threw the book at him and he survived. So that for me was kind of 1-1. And just I felt terrible about the young man that died, and then but when I was the boss, it was different. And I've always told all junior doctors and middle grade doctors to challenge their bosses, and if they don't agree with the boss, go above the boss, and never accept the hierarchy. There's always somebody else you can ask. And because it was a big mistake, but we live and learn, don't we? And so I think I was really proud when he survived and he walked out of the hospital alive.
Andy, I've been doing these talks now for a couple of years, and that's one of the most special, moving pieces we've had, actually.
Thank you.
To hear that and to hear the emotion that you've delivered that with is really something quite special, and it says exactly it says exactly every reason why you went into the profession, and to care and look after people, and clearly the emotional frustration and weight on you because you couldn't do what you wanted originally, but you managed to get there in the next one. I can only imagine the relief and satisfaction when you got to 1-1, and I hope you certainly get a chance to in the near future get a chance to go 2-1 or even 3-1 on that score.
Well, I'm not working on the wards anymore. I've come off the wards partly because of my age, and it's a kind of privilege when you get to my age not to do the hard yakka stuff. So I won't be looking after a man like that, but I do go to the weekly meeting where all the consultants meet and such patients are discussed, and we do have occasionally young people. There's always young people with this disease, and I always relay the story to them, and I say, if you think it's that, just do it, and don't mess about. And even if you're wrong, the treatment isn't that dangerous.
What one of the people that was asking, what was that kidney condition? Can you reveal that?
Extremely rare, hemolytic uremic syndrome. It's a ill understood, actually, a group of rare diseases. Some of them are caused by a rare bug called an O157 E. coli, which you get outbreaks in Scottish petting farms. I'm being serious. And there was a huge outbreak in Germany a few years ago with very high death rates. But some of them are due to infection, and some of them are what we call autoimmune. So in other words, it's when infection sets off an autoimmune process. So it's your own immune system attacking the small blood vessels inside the kidney and the brain and other places. It's a kind of fascinating but an absolute nightmare. But if you play your cards right, and there is a new drug which wasn't available to me in those two previous cases, called eculizumab, and it's the most expensive drug in the world. It's about $250,000, but we think that US taxpayers don't mind us spending vast amounts of money. Fortunately, because the disease is so rare, we don't have to open the bottle very often. But when we've got it on the ward, we all joke about, don't drop it.
That's an expensive mistake.
Very.
Thank you for sharing that story and that moment. Sophia asks, do you think more managerial roles should be carried out by people with clinical experience, and is that important?
Yeah, really important. And in fact, if you look at the page I've written on what is a hospital manager, the idea that the managers run the hospitals is false. Both at the head of a department, there's a middle level of administration called division, and then the upper level, the executive level, that's like the board of governors at a school. So our chief exec is like your headmaster or headmistress. At all levels, you get a triad of doctor, nurse, manager. The most senior doctor, the medical director, is virtually a full-time manager. They might only do one clinical session with patients a week. So at all levels in a hospital, you have a doctor, nurse, manager triad. And it's a very simple but effective system. So does that answer the question? I've forgotten the question now.
Managerial roles, should they be carried out by people with clinical experience?
Yeah. So the doctors and nurses should go on management courses, and they do, and the managers should go on clinical refreshers, and they do. And it's important that the managers are very hands-on and go onto the wards, go into the clinics, and actually see patients. Some of them are a bit reluctant to come out of their offices, but we usually wheedle them out with, coffee and cake and other things, and say, wouldn't it be fun to have a chat on the ward? And then we can point out, that machine's broken, that one doesn't work, and you need to fix that, and we need some more staff, all by Thursday, please. So generally, there's quite good banter in a hospital between the staff, and there's a few traditional old consultants who are a bit anti-manager, but you try running our hospital's budget, I think it's 150 million. These are 1,200 beds, 7,000 staff. You can't expect a doctor to run a hospital. It's not like it, like my mother's day with, one manager. They're just too complicated. But yeah, generally, our manager's called Adam and his boss is called Natalie, and I see them all the time, and we get on fine.
Andy, now I'm going to get onto a bit of my
okay.
Is the cost of the NHS is massive.
Yeah.
And you alluded to the size of the NHS in terms of what the fifth biggest employer in the world, something of that order.
Yeah.
Is it too big? How can you get better efficiencies? What would you do to be able to? I know it's a very open-ended question, but
I think it's a very good question. I think about it a lot. I think it should be broken up. I think the 7 regions should be like the states of Australia. When I worked in Australia, I was very impressed with the fact that I didn't work for the Australian Health Service. There's no such thing as the Australian Health Service. Yeah. I worked for the South Australian Health Service, and there was a South Australian police force and a South Australian judicial system. And federal government in Australia is much more like US federal government, that kind of, they do the foreign policy and the strategy, and otherwise then just go down the pub. And but the work is largely done at a state level, and I think we should have regional health services, and maybe via either the 7 regions we have, or originally there were 14 regions, and that seemed to be about the right number in my opinion. The other idea I've got is a bit more radical. There was discussion in the war period between Beveridge and Attlee and Bevan. There was another guy called Morrison there, and he had an idea that actually the health service should work out of the council. And I wonder whether, that people wouldn't like it, but if it was in some ways to work in a different ministry, like we moved to another ministry and we worked with the councils, then other laws come into play. So councils are by law not allowed to be bankrupt, or they all get sacked, and they do. And they have to sort of close swimming pools and libraries and things. With the health service, there's no such law. So we're bankrupt all the time. My hospital's 35 million bankrupt last year, and nobody batted an eyelid. So it leads to kind of very sloppy accounting. And I just wonder whether we applied some new laws whereby boards just got sacked for, even more than small amounts of bankruptcy. Then it would force you making hard decisions. But you might then have some extremely hard decisions, like you just stop doing hip replacements, cataracts, blah, blah, blah. So it would lead to some pretty horrific decision making that the public wouldn't like. And they would also stop paying for chemotherapy for childhood leukemia because it's too expensive and doesn't work, or it doesn't work for some cancer. So that's the problem. If you put financial bars on the health service like the council, it would have pretty devastating consequences. And I don't think any government would try it. I think, and we're a very London-centric country. So London, Oxbridge, King's Canterbury centric type of society. And and we like to keep power in the centre in a way that they don't in Australia. And so I don't think there'd be any truck for, NHS Southwest region as part of a Southwest regional government, for example. I think we like to keep the power in the centre, and in that way, and until we learn to spread power and money like in your country, I think we're probably doomed. But we do need some young people with very radical thoughts and ideas, and we need a government to stay in for at least 2 terms so they can fix them, you know, and we don't often have that, unfortunately.
There's going to be 2 more quick questions here, one from me and then one from the audience to finish off. I'll refer to actually to what they do in Australia, actually, and what they do in a lot of countries now. Should those other than the very poor pay, in Australia, it's about £15 to go to the doctors. Should there be a flat fee for, instead of putting 5% on everybody, say taxes, etc., should there be a flat fee for everybody other than a certain, the very poor, to go to a doctor?
I'll turn the question around with another question. What are you going to do if they won't pay or don't pay? You know, that's the problem, isn't it?
But what if you have to
are you going to lock them up for not paying their £15? You know, and they walk in with a big swollen eye. And I like the idea in principle, and in principle, I like the idea that when people actively don't turn up, you know, they have to pay a small penalty. But you have to create a huge bureaucracy to chase the money, and then you have to be willing to lock people up for not paying £15. And I feel also that money is not the problem in the NHS. In my talk, I didn't mention that money was a problem. We've got enough money because our income is based on the numbers of patients we look after. So we're the only branch of government where our income is based on population growth. You know, the people that build roads don't get more money because there's more cars, you know. So money is not really the problem, and it's how we spend it and what we do with it. And like I say, because no government allows the NHS either at a local or regional or national level to go bankrupt, you know, the Treasury just pays the bill, it leads to sloppy accounting. You couldn't run a school like that.
No.
You know?
And I suppose from my perspective, I'm just trying to think of ways that we can reward those people that look after their own health and keep as healthy as they could. And
yeah, it's hard though, isn't it? Because let's be frank, the advantaged people watching this video, including me and you, and many of the students going through school, look after themselves because they're intelligent and they're destined to live till they're 80 or 85. And the less advantaged people don't do what you're saying, don't get involved in preventative medicine. So if the other first lot got either were rewarded with money or paid money for them to get better healthcare, won't help the mega team. I haven't explained that very well.
No, basically what you say is you just widening the gap even further.
Yeah.
Because, last question. Andrew asks, you know, quite a lot of people are watching this talk now, and those people that are going to watch the talk on a replay at some stage, are considering becoming doctors. Sort of, what is your wisest advice that you would offer them at the start of their journey in that respect?
Well, before I give my wisest advice, I would just say what it's like to be a doctor. It's a huge privilege. I'm quite old and I still look forward to Monday mornings. And most of my friends from King's that went into the city and did money jobs, they've all retired, and they're retired in their, 50 to 55. They never liked their work anyway, but they live in big houses in Epsom with swimming pools, but they never found their work that interesting. But I find my work interesting every day. It's quite well paid. We have huge respect from the public, and it's fun. I can't believe it. They keep paying me good money to have fun. And so to answer the question, I guess my advice it's a bit old man advice, is work hard, every day. Don't accept the concept of a weekend. It's a human construct. It doesn't exist. Work hard every day for the public and not yourself, and work hard for the NHS. And if you don't, you won't become a good doctor and you won't find it interesting. That's why you've got to work hard, because you've got to get really good at it. And the only way to get good at it is to do a hell of a lot. It's probably like teaching, Greg, in your world. The more you teach, the better. And I bet you teachers in their 50s are probably better than teachers in their 30s, because they've done more teaching and they're better at it. And the journey in medicine is tough, and people keep knocking you off the train, but you just have to be like this slow train. And when you get disappointments, you fail exams, you retake them, you just keep going. And when everybody tells you it's too hard, too difficult, you need to get off the train, just completely ignore them and just keep going, because you will get there. And it's a really rewarding life. And if I had my life again, I would do the same. I probably would have not opened my big mouth on a few occasions, but and I wouldn't have been sent to Coventry, ha ha ha. But anyway, so that's what I would just say, because if you don't work hard, medicine will destroy you, because it's a punishing career for people that don't allow it to dominate their lives. There is time for a family and to get married and have children and do good things and have hobbies, and none of that is wrong. But unless you throw the book at it, hook, line, sinker, man and ball, your whole career, it'll destroy you. It is tough.
Andy, thank you so much for your wisdom, for the words that you've just said then. You've really highlighted the importance of the fact that you're going in as it's a vocation. You're going in, and I could have said exactly the same thing about teaching. I'm glad
Absolutely.
you had that reference on teaching. I don't necessarily think the 50-year-olds are better than 30-year-olds. However, if they've got the passion and the drive and the thought that you have, absolutely they will be. But it is a vocation, and it is the more you put in. I always use it. The more you put in, the more you get out. And there is no question that that's how I live my life in the.
But just to add to that, I mean, my wife's a teacher, and I feel exactly the same about teaching. These are vocations, not jobs. And if you go into it because you think it's a nice career or a job, or it's well paid, or people will respect you, forget it. It's the wrong career for you.
Yeah.
Unless you have this deep passion, for the British public and wanting to help them, it will be too much. And very similar to teaching.
Yeah. Thank you so much for your time, Andy. Hearing about the history of the NHS, it was amazing to hear about the relevance and how it grew and how it changed over the decades, and the relevance to the governments of each of its time, and perhaps the influence that they had, sometimes surprisingly, depending upon the political persuasion. Hearing about the organisation and the structure and the costs of the NHS, and answering your questions, it was hugely valuable to everyone watching and others that will watch this on a replay. And I agree with you, having lived near Coventry for 6 years. The Coventry Cathedral is the shining light in Coventry. With the greatest respect to all my friends that do, because I've got quite a few friends that live in Coventry. But it is the shining light in Coventry. I wouldn't want to speak too far beyond that. Once again, thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, for joining us tonight. I hope you found that extremely worthwhile as I did. And please do not hesitate to contact him. I'm sure if you want to contact Andy, we can put you in touch. Please contact the OKS office and myself, and we can put you in touch with Andy if you have any questions or if you want any advice on particularly careers in the medical profession. Thank you, Andy. Thank you for your time.
Thanks all. Have a good evening. Good luck with all your exams. You're at a great school.
Thank you, and good night. Thank you very much. Thanks for joining us.